So our speaker today, Lillian Wingate, she is a genealogist and historian that specializes in South Georgia research. She has been going to cemeteries since she was a small child and loves to share her findings and teach others the importance of cemeteries in genealogy research. Lillian has worked as the regional genealogist and local historian at the Statesboro Regional Library for over 8 years. And she teaches monthly classes there and assists patrons from all across the country with research. So she's a really great resource. I'm really excited for her to be here tonight to talk to us about cemeteries.
Thank you all for joining me tonight. We're going to be talking about cemetery etiquette and gravestone iconography. Some of the things we're going to go over tonight are the definitions of a graveyard and a cemetery, the do's and don'ts when visiting a cemetery, types of materials used for gravestones, the different types of gravestones, and the meanings of symbols, and lots of examples. I have lots and lots of photographs in this presentation, and all of the photographs are my photos that I've taken. I visit cemeteries quite often, so I'll be giving a little bit of a story with some of these as well. To begin with, what's the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery? A graveyard is always connected to a church, typically within the churchyard. They tend to be smaller than a cemetery due to the church only owning so much land. And churches tend to have stricter rules over who can be buried in their graveyard. For example, only church members, the individuals of the same faith, or family members. Cemeteries do not have to be connected to a church, but they can be associated with one. And cemeteries are usually much larger than a graveyard. Individuals of various faiths can be buried there. Some cemeteries do have requirements as to the type of headstone that's allowed. And so you might be kind of thinking in your head of different cemeteries you've been to, and most people today call almost any burial ground a cemetery. But you might be thinking of one where there is a church a little ways away, and you wonder if that's a graveyard or not. I have been to lots of old church graveyards that were founded in the 1800s, but later in the 1900s, a road had to be constructed. So today there's a road that separates the graveyard from the church itself, but when it was originally founded, it was still part of that church. So those do still count as graveyards. One other thing with cemeteries, you often do need permission to bury ashes in a cemetery. So let's talk about appropriate cemetery etiquette. The first rule of visiting a cemetery is to not disturb mourners or an active funeral. If possible, go to a different area further away or just come back at a different time. I have had classes planned at a cemetery, and it turned out there was a funeral going on not far away. We made sure to contact them and just rescheduled and came back afterwards. Always obey posted rules. Some church graveyards may have restrictions on who and when the visitors are allowed, and sometimes photography of gravestones is even restricted in church graveyards. And most importantly, only go during the permitted times. Cemeteries are respectable places. They're not for ghost hunts or anything like that. You also want to be mindful of where you sit and step. This is very, very important, and it's not also just the reason for disrespect, but many old graves, the coffin could have caved in. So the weight of you sitting or standing on that grave could cause the stone to fall in as well. These are examples of posted rules. A lot of church cemeteries or graveyards, they are going to have posted rules about when people can be there and who can be buried there. Sometimes private cemeteries are just that, they are private. So you need to get permission before going onto the property. These are examples of graves that have caved in. And this is why I say this is more of a danger issue instead of just the respect. As you can see from the photo on the left, this is a much older grave, but later on, curbing, which is right here, was put around it and rocks laid on top. And over time, with rainwater and things like that, the weight of the rocks has made the grave cave in. And then graves that probably did not have a full marker over them, they can still cave in even if they had a stone or not. These are examples of leaning headstones, which you probably see quite a bit if you go to older cemeteries. One thing I want to point out is you'll notice that the stones on the left are in a socket and the one on the right is not. Most people think that if a headstone is in a socket, it will last longer and stay upright, but they are actually more likely to break due to there not being much wiggle room for wind or if something were to push up against it. But the stones that are in the ground by itself are usually down over a foot, and then they have a little bit more room to move, and therefore they don't just break in half. This is an example of fallen monuments. As you can see, sometimes there was only a type of mortar that may have held the stones together. Other times it was just simply a little bit of rebar. That is not always going to be enough to keep these stones that weigh hundreds and hundreds of pounds together. So do be very careful if you see a broken or leaning gravestone, because you do not want to get in a dangerous situation with that. So let's talk about some inappropriate cemetery etiquette. Do not cause excessive noise. If you have family members who you have taken to the cemetery with you, but they don't want to walk around and stay in the vehicle, don't let them play music too loud. It's just that part is respect in case somebody else is there mourning. It's best to always leave your pets at home, even if they're allowed. And again, this is more of a safety issue. Do not leave any trash when visiting a cemetery. That includes water bottles, food, and especially cigarette butts. But food, even if it were, say, a banana or apple or something, that can attract other animals and insects, and that could cause a dangerous situation. And then you want to be mindful of mementos that you leave at an individual's graves. If it's something you are leaving that is a special memory and then you are coming back in a few days or something to clean it up, that's one thing. But try not to just leave things over a long period of time that could turn into debris. Things to be attentive of when visiting a cemetery or a graveyard. You always need to wear sensible clothing and shoes. There can often be thistles, briars. Here in Georgia, there's a surprising number of cacti that grow. Insects such as ants can be everywhere. I've actually almost been chased out of a cemetery before because the ants were everywhere. If you're visiting in the summer, please be aware of your surroundings and especially snakes. If the cemetery is on private property, as I mentioned earlier, you need to get permission before you go, not once you're there. Take a buddy with you if the cemetery is secluded or if you're unfamiliar with it. I'm one that me and my mother, we go kind of cemetery hopping sometimes. So, and then I have a very good friend who goes with me to lots of cemeteries as well. These are some examples of things I've encountered. You can see that there are two different snake skins around this grave. Snakes will get into cemeteries when they're shedding their skin. They can rub up against stones often to help them shed. And I'll point out that both of these are at least over 4 feet long. And I know this looks like a tiny little ant bed, but the photo that I took of this, I was probably 15 to 20 feet away from it. And that's still how big they appeared. We'll go over a few different types of materials used to mark graves. The part of the country that you live in or the country you live in, graves are going to vary in the materials they're made out of. Here in the United States, the more common things are field stones, wooden markers, concrete, bronze plates. I've started to see a lot more of just PVC piping, seashells, iron markers, brick, slate, sandstone, marble, limestone, granite, white bronze, zinc, and quartzite. So all the examples I'll be showing are graves that I have photographed in the state of Georgia. What's the difference between a grave marker, a headstone, and a gravestone? A grave marker is a flat bronze plaque that is installed on a stone to identify the deceased. A headstone is an upright monument that identifies the deceased. And a gravestone is an inscribed headstone or grave marker. So for most of this presentation, I will refer to the term gravestone for any type of grave that is marked. So here are examples of a grave marker and a headstone. There are also many different types of gravestones. We're going to be going over these, and not in any particular order, but tombs, a vault, a tablet stone, ledger stones, obelisk, military markers, mausoleums, different statues, beveled headstones, slanted headstones, and table tombs. So this is an example of a standard tablet headstone. One of these is in the ground and one is in the socket. Tablet headstones are usually rather thin. They're somewhere between 1 inch to 2.5 inches thick. These are rounded tablet headstones. One is in a socket, and of course, one's in the ground. Arched headstones. These can vary in thickness, but as you can see, these are a little bit thicker at the top, whereas this is an arched tablet headstone. You'll also notice both of these are actually made out of concrete, which would have been poured into molds and then stamped with the inscriptions. These are beveled headstones. They're also sometimes called raised top stones, so they are slanted and not flat. This is a bolster headstone. They are cylindrical, and they were very popular in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Most of the examples I've seen were only in about a 15 to 20 year period. So I'm not sure if it was due to the fact that the stones could actually be rolled around and then not left where the burial was unless it had a socket to hold it. This is a flathead stone or a lawn type. In many perpetual care cemeteries, this is the only type of stone that is allowed so that lawnmowers can get around them easily. This is a Gothic tablet stone in a socket, and you can see that both of these stones have been broken and repaired later. These stones date from 1894 and 1880, so they are contemporary. And then these are Gothic tablet stones that were in the ground. What's interesting is the stone on the left is from 1821 and on the right is 1832, and yet neither of these have broken. That just kind of shows you the difference that the socket can make with the stone. This is a trefoil headstone, which has the 3 kind of like crowns at the top. This is a ledger stone. These are going to be more common in locations that do not receive snow. Often these types of graves, they can be made of different types of materials, but it is completely flat on the ground. So in locations up north where it snows, they typically want headstones that are upright so that they can see them all year long. This is a wedge stone. So it is basically a ledger stone, and then at the top of it, it has a slanted stone at the top. Then we have tombs. This is where the deceased is actually buried above the ground in the tomb. And then they also have false tombs. There are various reasons for them, but they are not like a simple ledger stone. They're usually either pointed or they have a false tomb on top of them, but the deceased is still buried underground. You can also have a vault tomb, which is kind of a combination. So for most of these, the deceased is not buried as far down as most burials, but they are not fully above ground either. You also have mausoleums. In both of these examples, there is a door or doors in the center, and the deceased are stacked on the wall in burial chambers on each side. This is a table tomb. These were actually quite common in the 18th century when families would take picnics in the cemeteries. They would actually use the top of the grave as a table for that. This is a very old cemetery that has had a brick wall completely built around it, so it was kind of difficult to get to. There is also a fraternal organization that was kind of like an insurance company called Woodmen of the World. They helped people pay for their funerals and burials. So the grave markers will always have the emblem of Woodmen of the World. And these are just a few different examples. It usually looks like a medallion that is carved into the stone, and the stone looks like a tree trunk. You can also have tree trunk markers that are not Woodmen of the World, so you want to look for that medallion to distinguish them. Obelisks are something that are quite common as used for gravestones. Both of these, I believe, are over 10 feet tall. These are kind of smaller, and also this one is only about two and a half feet tall, so they can be short or quite tall. You have vaulted obelisk, where instead of just a single point, they have points on all four sides. A truncated or truncated with an orb obelisk. These are going to come out a little bit further and then go back in with something on top. Most of these that I have seen, the top has broken off of them. So as they get more elegant and designs at the top, those tend to break over time. This is a rooftop obelisk. You can see where it's got multiple of the roofs on there. An orb marker, which of course this one I believe was almost 2 feet in diameter. Column markers. If you'll notice this one, it is actually kind of broken at the top, but that is how it was meant to be. When you see a broken column, it is signifying that there's a life cut short. In the South, you see brick markers quite often. There are not many quarries down here, stone quarries, so they had to use the materials they had available to mark graves. Often you will see where there is brick or concrete, and then at a later date, a stone has been placed there. Concrete markers are very common in South Georgia. These are examples of an infant and then one where a wooden frame would have been built and they covered 2 graves with the concrete. These are examples of concrete markers that would have been poured into molds and frames. The concrete could then also be stamped with words. This is a Bible passage on the left, and the one on the right, it's stamped with the deceased information. Many might have been handwritten. I personally love seeing the ones that are handwritten on there because it kind of tells you a little bit more about that person and the family that is making the grave. They can be decorated with marbles and seashells. These are 2 of my favorites. These were stamped with designs. You can see the little pattern on the inside, but they have the inscriptions that were also stamped, but even a handprint. These are both from the late 1800s, so I'm kind of surprised they have lasted this long. Zinc markers are something that were popular in the late 1800s. Out of a few dozen that I've seen of these, only 2 or 3 of them were actually damaged. They look very much like stones, particularly like granite stones. And from what I've seen, they hold up fairly well. You can tell the difference by knocking on them and you will hear that it's hollow inside. This is an example of one of the zinc markers that has broken. I'm not sure if it was due to maybe weather or something falling on it or just rust in general. Iron markers also used to be popular for a while. And you can see the inserts here. This is where a wooden plaque would have been inserted with the deceased information. But of course, because the iron marker rust, the oxidation caused the wood to rot as well. So Those usually do not last. This is an example of some wooden markers that have lasted, but the inscriptions have long faded. I also wanted to show kind of some of those grave decorations. We know that we love our loved ones. We want to remember them, but you do need to be careful about what you leave at their graves. If it is something that can blow away with the wind or impedes lawn care of the cemetery, that can hurt other graves. So do be careful about the mementos you leave behind. You might visit some older graves that have grave fences around them. For most of these that I have seen in South Georgia, these are some of the oldest graves in the cemetery. They were typically in the middle of the cemetery, and it was to protect the grave from wandering livestock. This was before they kept the livestock fenced in, and they would just wander, and they had fences around the crops. So they didn't want a cow walking across the grave and falling in. For many children's graves, you might see what's called a cradle. This could be done with bricks or stone. I've also seen just wooden, kind of like spikes. It was just small pieces, but it made the little cradle for a child's grave. For an adult, when you see this, it's normally called a flower box or just the curbing. This is where they would often plant flowers in the grave. And especially if you're in the South, if you ever visit a cemetery and you see daffodils growing in the middle of the cemetery, especially if there's no headstone around, that could very well be an indication that that was a grave. You also have scalloped headstones and those with shells. This is a concrete grave that had seashells placed in it before it dried. Pulpit or altar headstones were very common. These could actually be ordered from the Sears catalog in the early 1900s. This is an example of a headstone and a footstone. You see these more commonly in cemeteries that had family plots and they were not all buried one after the other. And this was the purpose of marking where the grave ends so they know where to bury the others. Cenotaphs are often something you see for military, but it could be for an individual. A cenotaph is somebody who is not buried there. The stone is simply marking their memory, and they could have incorrect dates since a lot of these are placed much later. I know for a fact the stone on the left, the cenotaph, for some reason they have a date of 1904 when in fact that person died in 1863. So be leery of stones you see placed long after a person's deceased. Epitaphs are also something that is common at cemeteries. An epitaph is a marker that is memorializing those who are buried in that location, or perhaps telling about the family, and it's just writing and giving you more information. Memorials are going to list family members and their information, but often they are not buried in that cemetery. In both of these instances, I believe the parents and 2 or 3 of the children are buried in that cemetery, but they have listed all of their children with their birth and death dates, even though they are in other locations. A family stone can actually be one of 2 things. The marker on the left is a more recent stone that was placed mentioning the names of many people buried in that cemetery, but in unmarked graves. So they are listing the full family who is buried there. And then the photo on the right, this is a family stone that would be placed in a family plot in the cemetery, and it's telling you what the plot name is. You can have arched husband and wife markers, and these can come in many different forms. Some have square and some have rounded arches. A double burial headstone can also come in many ways. Sadly, these are for infant twins, and a mother and a child who died in childbirth. I've also seen double headstones for husband and wife. So military headstones. We're going to talk about a Civil War type. This is a stone that has a carved image of a shield with the name, the rank, and home state of the soldier. Originally, they were only used for Union soldiers, but today it can be used for the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Indian campaigns, Spanish-American War, and others. What distinguishes these is that they have rounded tops and the shield is inset in the stone. And they typically do not have any dates listed. Confederate soldiers were not provided with a military or government-issued headstone until 1906. The difference between the Confederate markers is the top is pointed and that there is no shield design. And the words are carved inward, and they do typically have dates. And often you will see the Southern Cross of Honor at the top of it. You also have a general type, which began to be used after World War I. Most of these are flush to the ground. Others are about 4 inches thick, 13 inches wide, and 42 inches above the ground. And when you think of places like Arlington Cemetery, that is going to be your general type of marker. Not all military headstones are government issued or official. A veteran may have had, or their family may have chosen a different stone or just not wanted all of their information displayed. These are examples of the Civil War type. So you can see here it has a rounded top. And this one, you can see that shield that is carved inwards, and then the words are coming out. And notice they will list the type of war, so the Spanish-American War and the Revolutionary War, but no dates for the individual. This is an example of a Confederate marker. So it is pointed at the top. Often they will have the Southern Cross of Honor, either an iron cross or the carved image of it on the stone. These are a few others that are Confederate markers still. So this is more of the flat marker that certain cemeteries do require, but they have the Confederate Cross of Honor across the top. And this stone, I think it just is interesting. It has the company name, and it simply says Southern Baptist pastor over 30 years. The name of the individual is not even on the stone. This is the general type. Most of these are going to be for World War I or World War II, and they also have the same dimensions to the lawn type that we showed earlier. These are the general type, the bronze markers. Both of these examples are installed on a stone, but they could also be directly in the ground. It will always have the war listed and other information. This is a non-government issued stone. So the one on the left actually has two different stones where they have images, they have the battles that took place and mention when it was marked. And the one on the right, even though it is for a revolutionary soldier, notice that the words go inward. So that is one that somebody probably paid for themselves so that they could put the dates on it. So now let's talk about symbols and their meanings. Gravestones often have carved symbols on them that may convey more information about the deceased than just the inscription. Some symbols do have more than one meaning and interpretation. And it's not always easy to identify the stones that are more weathered. So let's see some examples of these. An anchor is a common symbol to show the passageway to heaven and victory over death. And you can also notice in most of these, they have more than one symbol on them. You have an angel or a cherub. The angels represent agent of God and guardians over death, and cherubs represent innocence. A crown is usually life or glory after death, victory over death, and also resurrection. A crown with a cross is the departed soul gaining victory over death through Christ the King. And you'll notice that many of these do have Christian meanings behind them, Again, most of these photos are all taken in South Georgia. A crucifixion represents a true Christian. A Star of David is representative of the Jewish faith. And you can also see in many Jewish cemeteries, there will be stones left on top of the grave, which is usually that somebody has been there to visit them. If you see a dove with an olive branch, it means peace and forgiveness. And this could be on a child or an adult's grave. A dove in flight, when it is flying up, is the soul's journey to heaven. And a resting dove will represent peace and innocence. If you see a dove in flight with a rose bud or a rose bloom, that is typically going to be the child's soul journeying to heaven. And both of these examples, you can kind of see the little rosebud that is not fully bloomed, and that is indicative of a child. A book or a Bible, this will typically show that the person may have been either a clergy or just a devoted religious individual. If you see books, and especially kind of open books, it can represent that this person was literate. And it could also be representative of the good deeds being recorded in the book of life. The photo on the left was a stone that I actually cleaned, and it had algae growing all over it, lichen. And it wasn't until it was cleaned that we realized that this was actually books that were carved on top of the stone. Drapes and curtains represent mourning and grief. Now you'll notice both of these, they cover the entire top of the marker. So that is showing the veil between the living and the deceased. If you see this only covering half of the marker, that is showing the human shedding its mortal body to join God, or the protective nature of God. A hand pointing up, this is showing that the departed has gone to heaven and asked grieving and mourning to look up to where they have gone. The hand pointing down is God's hand reaching down for the soul of the deceased. Often this is indicating that there was a sudden or unexpected death. If you see a hand with a broken chain, it represents a loss in family, a break in the family chain. In almost every case I've seen with the broken chain, it is usually representing either a parent or a husband or wife who died suddenly, but not young children. A hand with a book is the embodiment of faith. A hand with a cross is unwavering faith and reminding those alive to have faith. Handshakes are something you might see quite often. This is a final farewell or the eternal bond between the living and the deceased. You do need to pay close attention when you see the handshakes. They could be two clasped hands, which represent that eternal bond, or the limp hand, which is typically the final farewell. You can also have what's known as the husband and wife kind of handshake. This is eternal devotion and showing the bonds of matrimony. Make sure to pay attention to the sleeves. You'll notice over here, you can see the frills on the wife's sleeves and the buttons on the husband's, and the same in this one. And you also see the little crown that represents matrimony. If a hand is coming from the clouds, it's the hand of God reaching down from the heavens. This can also symbolize that the individual may have died suddenly and that they were not elderly. This has helped me in many cases where the stone was unreadable, but it gave me an indication of the person's age. A square and compass, which is the Masonic emblem, represents Freemasons. A fern frond represents serenity and humility, and it's often shown with other floral symbols as well. So it's good to kind of put all of these meanings together. A pine cone is representative of spiritual enlightenment. Calla lily is resurrection and rebirth, overcoming challenges, and faith and purity. So sometimes when they have multiple meanings like this, looking at the other information can tell you a bit more. For instance, when it is a young child, I would imagine it is faith and purity. not necessarily the overcoming challenges, which might represent someone a little bit older. Easter lilies are the resurrection of Christ. Lily of the valley, which is innocence and humility and renewal and resurrection. Some of these symbols can be carved very differently, especially when it's more of a drawn or flat image versus a carved into it, almost like a statue. So it really takes looking at the different symbols to figure out what they are sometimes. A rose in full bloom is immortal love and can represent that the person died in the prime of their life. The more the rose appears to have bloomed, the older the individual. So you can see in the left, you can see some of the petals are already kind of peeling backwards to show that it was fully bloomed. If you see a broken stem, and especially a rose bud, as indicated here, this is a premature or untimely death or a life cut short. So this is what you will typically see for infants. A poppy, which represents eternal sleep. You can see the poppies carved in the corners. A passion flower, which represents the passion of Christ. This also symbolizes the soul's redemption through Christ. I'll admit these are two of my favorite stones when I was finally able to find these. A wreath represents victory over death, and the circular shape of the wreath can stand for eternal memory and immortality. The open gates is passage from earth to heaven, basically through the heavenly gates. With most of these, there will be another symbol in between the gates, so you definitely want to pay attention to that. These are just more examples of those symbols between the open gates. A flying hourglass represents how fast time flies during life, and the wings can also represent flight into the afterlife. A lamb represents innocence and purity, usually on a child's grave. They can take many different forms. Sometimes they're laying, sometimes their head is held up. A tree trunk or a stump, it represents a life cut short. And in this case, all three of these are infants, and there's also a lamb on each three. An orb represents the earth and cosmos. Stars represent the light of the Holy Spirit overpowering death. And when you see 3 stars, it's usually representing the Holy Trinity. An upside down star is the Order of the Eastern Star. A weeping willow is immortality and life after death. And today we take it to mean mourning and grieving more, but it typically stood for immortality. An urn represents that we all turn to ashes or dust. Today, you may see the urns on newer graves, and they're simply used for flowers, but it may have more symbolism there. A draped urn is showing, shedding the earthly body, going to heaven. Wheat, this can represent believers over non-believers, the redemption. You must die to be reborn in the body of Christ. But one other thing that is very interesting about wheat bushels is you usually only see them on the graves of those who have lived for over 70 years. In this case, both of these gentlemen were over 70. He was 71 and he was a pastor. So definitely kind of believers over non-believers. It is on his wife's headstone as well, although she was 69 when she passed. So that could have been a little bit of just redemption. Ivy, which you usually see in accompaniment with other symbols, represents immortality and eternal friendship. While a loved one may be gone, they are not forgotten. Grapes and grapevines represent the blood of Christ and God's care. Corn can represent rebirth and fertility, and it's also associated with farmers quite often. I've also seen that it can represent the spiritual goodness and that the individual lived a long life. A palm frond represents victory of the spirit over the flesh, and a beehive represents Christianity and faith, or that the individuals worked or helped with the church. So these are a lot of the older symbols. I did want to share that these are some of the books you might look at for further research. These are excellent resources. Stories Told in Stone, Understanding Cemetery Symbols, and then Cemetery and Gravestone Handbook. All three of these do have great examples of iconography with stones. And I also kind of want to show you a few modern symbols that you might see on stones today. Keep in mind when you see modern stones that have been engraved with a laser, basically, instead of hand carved, since it can be done so easily today, the meanings are a little bit different. So these are some modern symbols that you may see on stones that may tell you more about the person's personality or their individual life, which is still helpful in doing genealogy, but it might not represent what they did in the past. So for instance, here you have two doves flying together. There are actually painted roses on this stone and a semi-truck. Crosses and roses, poppies, these are all things that are now typically done with lasers instead of hand carved. And of course, sports teams. I have seen many gravestones with their favorite sports team on there. Tools, the grapevines that we just saw a minute ago. Crosses or indications of their religion. This one I particularly like. This is a niche in the stone where a small rock or stone can be left to show that somebody visited the grave. Again, we have more sports teams, tractors, cherubs and doves carrying the little rosebud, golf clubs. I'm starting to see a lot more animals carved on gravestones and trucks, surprisingly. These are the flowers, poppies, and ivy. This one does have a sundial on it, which can represent the passing of time. Here we have a dove and a lamb, but they do look quite different from some of the earlier carved ones. A candle, and then the husband and wife hands, which you can read or at least see the sleeves quite easily on these. Again, animals, they have all of their pets carved with their names on this stone. Here is a passion flower and pine cones carved on this stone. So this one I did feel like they were trying to represent things that the meanings that we've already gone over, the Passion of Christ and so forth. Here's one of the hand of God reaching down from the clouds. And then, of course, roses in full bloom. Again, tractors, lambs, crosses, but these are things that are carved much easier today. Here we have a cowboy hat, a tractor, couple, but they also have the Good Book of Life over here. High heel shoes, a scenery with fields, basically a stag and a lighthouse, which these are probably Christian in meaning. Another scene of fields. Now that stones can actually be colored with the American flag, and this stone actually has the calla lilies carved in it. I'm seeing a surprising number of musical notes and instruments in stones nowadays, and I often wonder if some of these, if a tune could be played with them. This one was quite interesting. This shows a clock in a jar, and it is actually stopped at the time that the person passed away. And then, of course, a small angel. Here are just more examples of daffodils, tractor, dove, the tree of life, butterflies, which again could be representative of Christian values, or it could be something that they like themselves. Here we've got, I believe, poppies, a train, and another train and Bibles. So these are just some examples of more modern symbols that you might find on gravestones today. So that is the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Somebody was wondering, is it still a graveyard if the church is gone? So once they're saying, i.e., it was once connected to a church, but that church was moved, torn down, etc.
It kind of depends who has jurisdiction over it now. I was just talking to someone yesterday that the cemetery, it is connected to a church, but that church has gone through 4 different denominations. So technically it is still a graveyard.
The next person, and this is a big one because a lot of people like to argue about this particular thing that I've seen online at least. What do you use to clean the headstone?
I recommend the D2 biological solution. A soft bristled brush. You don't want to use anything that you wouldn't use on your own skin, and lots of water. Never use any harsh chemicals, do not use bleach, and do not use any wire brushes. I do have another video on our library's YouTube channel where I show how to properly clean gravestones. You need to have permission to clean the gravestone from the cemetery and from someone related to the family.
The next person said that they are putting together a cemetery book for their church. What are your feelings on editing a photo to more clearly show the information and pictures on the stone?
I think that is an excellent idea because that is not damaging the stone in any way. Photoshop and things like that are wonderful tools. They discourage doing any kind of rubbings on gravestones today in order to do that because you could damage the stone.
Somebody had actually asked in the chat earlier, where are the cemeteries, like the locations of cemeteries you were going to find all these interesting
Most of
headstones?
these are all in South Georgia. I think I've visited over 100 cemeteries and have a couple 100,000 photos.
What do you use when someone's using the worm, the cleaning stuff? Well, she sent another thing saying the cleaning stuff. I'm not sure I'm quite following.
I know one question I've had in the past, stones that have been cleaned improperly, like with bleach, and have yellowing, they've asked what to do for that. And unfortunately, there isn't much. Once it's damaged, there's not much undoing. So I don't know if that's what she meant.
Yeah, that's what she meant. Wrong. Like, what
Okay.
do you do when someone's using the wrong cleaning stuff?
I have started putting up just the little kind of either pink or orange flags beside the graves that I've cleaned, and I will either write a note or have a little sign put up that, you know, so and so is cleaning this with this, so they can contact me if they want to.
I found it interesting that the name parish often showed up. Oh, in your pictures? Are you related to the
Yeah.
parishes? Yeah.
That's a very large family in this area. The parish and, as I mentioned, Hodges are families in this area a lot.
I feel like I might be related to some parishes down there too.
Probably half of those photos were all my ancestors. And then the presentation I do about how to properly clean them, I have those are all my family who I've cleaned or been contacted to clean.
Somebody also said your photographs are really great. Do you have any tips for good pictures of the headstones in cemeteries?
Yes, you need to pay attention to the time of the day, and it depends what type of cemetery you're going to. So most Christian cemeteries, the graves are facing east. So it's either best to go in the middle of the day or later in the day. You don't want the shadow, like your shadow, to be on the grave. So if you're going to a Jewish cemetery, it's better to go and believe it's in the morning so that the sun's facing the other way, because those will be facing west. And as far as lighting for those photos, you can take like a flashlight and do that, but also get a mirror and shine the sunlight into the grave. So it will catch all those little shadows.
That's a good idea. I'm gonna have to file that one away. That's great.
I upload all my photos on Find a Grave, so I've got several thousand on there. I will mention that depending on your location, you will see different graves and different materials. Like I said, down here in the South, there aren't many stone quarries, so they use what they had. So depending where you are, you may see something completely different.
If anybody would like a copy of the chat, or if you have more questions, feel free to send us an email. Our email is genealogy@acpl.info. Thanks everybody for showing up this evening, and thank you, Lillian, for such a great presentation.
Thank you.